HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Things We Make, The Unknown History of Invention from Cathedrals to Soda Cans, by Bill Hammack. Read by Jonathan Todd Ross. Publisher's Note: This audiobook contains references to visuals present in the print and ebook editions of the book. Nearly everyone believes, falsely, that technology is applied science. Technology is more closely related to art than to science, not only materially, because art must somehow involve the selection and manipulation of matter, but conceptually as well, because the technologist, like the artist, must work with many unanalyzable complexities. Another popular misunderstanding today is the belief that technology is inherently ugly and unpleasant, whereas a moment's reflection will show that technology underlies innumerable delightful experiences, as well as the greatest art, whether expressed in object, word, sound, or environment. Cyril Stanley Smith, A Search for Structure. Introduction. When I visit Paris, my first stop is to tour the 13th century cathedral of the Palais de la Cité, the Sainte-Chapelle. I enter the lower chapel just as a servant of France's 13th century monarchs would have done in pious worship. Supplicants must admire for a moment its gilded arches and deep blue ceilings showcasing the wealth and power of the medieval French royalty, then climb a circular staircase, its stone walls a dungeon-like dull gray. I clutch the rail to keep balance on the uneven steps, eager to reach the upper chapel, reserved in the past for the king and queen alone, but now open to all in service of the French Revolution's egalitarian values. I pass a small sign that commands silence as I step into the upper chapel. When I do, I am, in the words of a 14th century French philosopher, entering into one of the best chambers of paradise. And indeed, the chapel stuns all visitors into silence, never mind the sign. Once there, I settle into a pew and gaze at the chapel's 400-ton stone ceiling and walls. The slenderest of pillars, slightly less than a foot in diameter, support an array of stained glass windows that transform sunlight into a diffused red, blue, and gold, glimmering on the chapel's vari-colored sculptures and gilded arches. This light, a hallmark of Gothic architecture, was a sharp departure from the dark, somber buildings of the Romans in late antiquity. The immense Roman structures, the Pantheon in Rome and Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, established an earthly empire with their heavy, thick walls, while the light streaming through the translucent Gothic ceiling of the Sainte-Chapelle symbolized an otherworldly spiritual power. What I see, though, as an engineer, is an exemplar of the strategy used from the dawn of humankind to today by all engineers to create objects and systems. Naively, we assume the products of engineers arise from the scientific method. There's an old, slightly bitter joke among engineers about the relationship between science and engineering. If it's a success, then it's a scientific miracle. If a disaster, then an engineering failure. This joke highlights the fact that successful technologies are invisible. We think of our furnace only when it fails. Less naively, perhaps, we assume the secret of engineering lies in the mastery of arcane realms of knowledge, sophisticated calculus, and powerful computing science implemented by a dispassionate, almost mechanical person. But the power of engineers lies in their method, a method used long before sophisticated mathematics and computers. Indeed, modern engineers use sophisticated mathematics and a thorough knowledge of the strength of a steel beam or a slab of reinforced concrete to design a structure that withstands forces far beyond what it will ever suffer in its lifetime. The safety margin for a skyscraper requires it to hold against what engineers call a 100-year wind. the strongest wind predicted to occur once every century in the skyscrapers locale. These sophisticated tools and techniques, though, are not the engineering method. The Sainte-Chapelle was designed and constructed by a team of builders who had never learned basic arithmetic or the geometry taught today in third grade. Even if they were lucky enough to be educated in reading, writing, and math, they would use them without a standardized length of the foot, as it varied from region to region. Yet medieval engineers understood stone structure so well that only a small fraction of cathedrals collapsed in their lifetime of service, before centuries of weathering and neglect after the Reformation compromised them. Their design and construction, noted a 20th-century engineer schooled in modern construction methods, were, by almost any yardstick, almost perfect. In many ways, the Sainte-Chapelle's builders had, without modern tools and techniques, a deeper understanding of stone-based architecture than today's engineers would ever hope to develop. Few today would stake their reputation on building a stone cathedral, a problem for their restoration and preservation. This highlights the notion that what defines engineering, then, is not the tools, not the computer algorithms, structural analysis, or scientific knowledge of construction materials, but the method. The purpose of this book is to lift the veil and show the engineering method in all its glory. This will reveal the creativity of engineers, demonstrate the pinnacle of the suppleness of the human mind, and lay a foundation about how to think about technology, how to decide its proper use, aid it in fulfilling its promise, but also understand its limitations. So this is not a history of engineering, although it draws from all periods of history. Nor is it a celebration of the rise of the West, examples abound from other cultures, but a description of engineering, a deep look at its foundations, and an examination of how it can be used to shape our world. To illustrate the method, there is no better example than the design of a cathedral. It strips bare the tools often confused for the engineering method, scientific inquiry, mathematical manipulation, to expose what lies at the heart of the method, a surprisingly simple notion called a rule of thumb. Chapter 1. The Invisible Method. How to build a cathedral without mathematics, science, or a yardstick. A cathedral, even under construction, was a startling sight of order in the chaos of a medieval city. The church's regular proportions and clean stone contrasted with the filth surrounding it. The ground around the site was a sickly mixture of mud, refuse, broken crockery, rotting meat, and human feces, the detritus from a constant hum of human activity. Thousands of people filled a medieval city, farmers guiding ponies and pack horses laden with grain, or steering carts overloaded with eggs, milk, and cheese, and shepherds coaxing sheep and cattle to market. To escape this mire, children often climbed the half-built walls of the rising cathedral, undeterred by the prickly briars placed on them by the town authorities. Like the town, the work site buzzed with activity, but here order was kept under the command of the head mason, a man whose job combined 5 modern roles: engineer, architect, materials contractor, building contractor, and construction supervisor. These responsibilities gave him over 100 workers to manage, who swarmed over the work site in a cacophonous chaos, the squeal of the grindstone as blacksmiths sharpened chisels, the hiss of a furnace as they forged tools, the hammer blows of plumbers as they shaped lead into eaves and gutters, the snap of a whip as a worker drove oxen to power a giant crane that lifted stone blocks, and the rasp of saws as carpenters cut boards for the intricate scaffolding that held the stone blocks as they were laid. A cathedral's construction gobbled some 4,000 trees. Almost masked by this din were the intermittent sharp pings of hammers coming from a small thatch-roofed building. In this lodge, attached to one of the cathedral's walls, 10 or so masons worked at benches, chiseling many thousands of limestone blocks into the shapes dictated by a set of wooden templates. As they worked, the masons chattered in Hungarian, Polish, German, French, and Dutch. This itinerant workforce easily found employment. France alone constructed 10 churches a year. And these elite workers were well paid. The masons took home almost twice as much as the carpenters, who themselves earned about 3 or 4 times the wages of unskilled workers, like the women who collected the moss the masons used for bedding roof tiles. The masons worked from sunrise to sunset, with time off for breakfast, lunch, and a drink. In summer they also broke for a siesta. Every 14 days their work finished 2 hours early so the masons could go to the baths, a perk available only to them. Unlike the carpenters and other workers, the masons all wore the same type of clothes issued by the cathedral's patron: leather hoods to protect their shoulders when carrying stones, gloves, boots for wet weather, straw hats for summer, and a robe. As these masons worked, the head mason, his robe trimmed in fur, walked from bench to bench holding in his gloved hand a baguette, French for rod or wand, here meaning a long, unmarked iron rod used as the standard measure for that particular cathedral. He hovered over the younger masons as they carved the stones, correcting their use of templates to shape the stones as he pointed with his baguette. His repeated refrain was, "Cut it there for me." This head mason, the central figure in the construction of a cathedral, commanded benefits far surpassing those of his journeyman masons: a food allowance, fodder for his horse, sometimes freedom from taxes for life, and often payment in silver, linen, wood, shoes, meat, salt, and candles as a guarantee against depreciating currency. With these fringe benefits, patrons hired a versatile worker. Head masons designed the machines that transferred stone from quarry to job site, and the cranes that lifted the stones, and one master even fixed the plumbing of the King of England's toilet. But the head mason's most important task was creating the wooden templates used to guide the journeyman masons as they cut the stones. Aware of the acute focus needed, the younger masons left their master alone, when the Latin phrase intrasura buzzed around the lodge. All then knew the master was working in the tracing room. In the tracing room, which we would today call a drawing room, the head mason laid out thin planks of oak, fir, or pine specially imported for his use from Norway, Russia, Germany, and the Low Countries. He chalked on the boards the shapes for the faces of the stones, constructing those shapes using only a compass, dividers, straight edge, and rope. The likely illiterate head mason created these shapes without blueprints or even much of a written design. Instead, in his mind, he decomposed the construction into thousands of 3-dimensional puzzle pieces that, when assembled, formed a complete cathedral. Because the building plan existed almost entirely in the head mason's memory, patrons often insisted that the master be on site during construction, although a head mason could be in such demand that he often traveled widely throughout Europe to work on several buildings at a time. But the mason's design was not mere puzzle assembly. The result had to be a unique monument to the noble patron's wealth and piety that stood for ages. As one head mason advised his trainee son, "An honorable work glorifies its master," adding, "if it stands up." In the shaping of the templates, the head mason maintained and transmitted the knowledge necessary to create a stable structure. To support the large interior spaces of his cathedral, a head mason could choose from 2 techniques that evolved as architecture moved from merely shelter, in the form of huts and tents, to grand public structures. they could use the method that the Greeks honed to perfection in the Parthenon, a post and lintel system, what we would call a roof supported by columns. Although the Greeks made stunning structures, this method creates buildings with small, dark interior rooms, as the columns fill the available lateral space. An architect designing for a larger spanned space would find that the slab of stone forming the roof needed more frequently placed columns to support it. For even larger buildings, then, this method becomes uneconomic and unpleasing. The post and lintel returned in the 19th century with the development of cast iron columns and girders, improved later by high-quality steel beams, but builders intending to create grand monuments in antiquity could only turn to the option perfected by the Romans, the arch. Roman emperors knew that the look of a building mattered. Architecture was a visual cue to the people that they lived in a Roman city, imbued with and ruled by Roman power, that they were and would be either Roman citizens or Roman subjects forever. And while the Romans liberally adopted the post and lintel from the Greeks, the unique imperial style was one of curves, buildings with large centralized spaces on a huge scale covered by domes as exemplified by the Pantheon, the temple of the gods in Rome. Its rotunda is capped with a 144-foot diameter concrete dome, found so beautiful by Michelangelo that he called it angelic and not of human design. Their imperial architecture featured on a heroic scale the semicircular arch and its three-dimensional manifestations, the vault and the dome, which enable spaciousness and grandeur far beyond what is possible with post and lintel thanks to the arch's marriage of geometry and stability. But for the masons of the Middle Ages, this type of arch presented a problem. The semicircular arch's height is always half that of its width. The head masons wanted to create churches that soared, but if they used the classical Roman arch, for every foot they added to a church's height, its width would expand by 2. To keep cathedrals from ballooning to sprawl across city blocks, they turned to an Islamic modification, the ogival, or pointed arch. This style, notable for its tall and slender shape, was first used in Buddhist India in the 2nd century A.D., and from there spread to the Near East by the 7th century, just in time for the newly created Islamic world to use in the construction of mosques. As true of Jerusalem's Dome of the Rock, with the 8 entrances to its temple grounds adorned with pointed arches, Islamic architecture chose the ogival arch over the semicircular arches that dominated the Christian buildings of the late Roman Empire. Despite the religious differences, the pointed arch could rise high with a base of any span, and thus was the perfect tool for the Catholic European masons when creating spectacularly high ceilings for their medieval cathedrals. To safely and economically construct such breathtaking beauty, the cathedral's mason had to correctly size the thickness of the wall supporting the arch. If this wall were too thin, the weight of the arch would buckle the wall. If the walls were too thick, stone would be wasted and the desired open space inside the cathedral diminished. To size the wall, the head mason would need to use a rule inherited from late antiquity, a rule that created the Pantheon and Hagia Sophia. A stable arch results when the wall's thickness is a little more than 1/5 of the arch's span. The head mason, though, had likely never learned to read, let alone calculate a dimensional ratio. Instead, he carried out this rule without a yardstick marked with numerals, without Euclidean geometry, with only the most basic mathematics. He ran a rope along the arch template, as if draping the rope over the arch itself. He then cut the rope to equal the full length of the arch as it curved from the first wall, up to the arch's peak, and down to the other wall. Then, laying the freshly cut rope straight, he folded it into thirds and marked each fold with colored chalk. With the rope now marked into 3 sections of equal length, He returned it to its original place draped along the arch template. Using the chalk marks on the rope, he could mark 2 key spots on the arch itself, each falling a short way down from either side of the arch's peak. By pinning the rope in each of those chalk-marked spots, he could then pull the rope's bottom thirds taut to create straight lines from the pinned spots to the points where each side of the arch met its supporting wall. The length of that straightened portion of rope and its particular angle became key, as the mason would then cut another portion of rope identical to it in length and lay it end to end to extend the path of the taut portion of rope in a straight line. That extension would become the hypotenuse of a right triangle in the mason's head, though it's unlikely he had heard of either in his life, the shortest leg of which would become his final measurement. The width of the arch's supporting walls, which ensures centuries of stability, all without even the simplest mathematical calculation. This proportional rule derived from 1,000 years of application and refinement. As more structures stood with dimensions defined by the proportional rule, that rule would continue to be passed on orally and used repeatedly. We can see it applied in the mid-13th century Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, and in the main façade of the Cathedral of Hirone, built some 150 years later and 600 miles south. This rule was one of many that formed a complex body of knowledge known only to head masons, rules that drew on the intuition a mason developed over a lifetime of building. Use your own good thinking, a head mason advised his son in training. A typical judgment was to assess the quality of the stone used for the blocks. Did it have seams of weaker stone? Did it crumble or crack when tapped by a hammer? Did a block left exposed to water for weeks deteriorate? If using excellent quality stone, they subtracted 3 inches from the wall thickness as calculated before, and if weak stone they added 3 inches. A mason might also make modifications during construction. If he observed the stones move or shake, then he would replace the stones with different shapes. Or the head mason would inspect the dried mortar and look for cracks that indicated stresses, then reinforce the structure. This is the engineering method, a process of methodical and actionable problem-solving, the force that has created the human world as we know it. And by observing how medieval masons in 13th century France harnessed this force, we can create a definition of the method at its most elemental. Using rules of thumb to solve problems with incomplete information. This simple statement seems to promise nothing exciting, yet it enabled a medieval engineer, the head mason, to build intricate, stunning cathedrals without the technical knowledge we prize today. No understanding of the strength of a material, the precise stress and strains inside a block of stone, or even the mathematical ability to calculate a simple ratio. And even more astonishing, the mason had no idea that he was missing this knowledge. At no point was a mason saying to himself, "If only I could calculate the breaking strength of this rock." To imagine he did so is anachronistic, reading today's way of engineering onto the past. The mason's ability to succeed despite the shortcomings we perceive highlights the importance of rules of thumb, that the engineering method is composed solely of experience-derived provisional guidelines, none of which guarantee a correct answer, yet when woven together create works of stunning utility, reliability, and beauty. It seems almost unbelievable that the application of the engineering method revolutionized the world, yet from the flint tools of our cave-dwelling past to today's digital marvels, engineers have used these rules of thumb to accomplish the greatest acts of human creativity, to push the limits of human ingenuity. A rule of thumb, more formally called a heuristic, is an imprecise method used as a shortcut to find the solution to a problem. It is an idea so old and pervasive The practically every language seems to have its own corresponding term, uncannily following a theme of body parts. In French, le pif, the nose. In German, Faustregel, the fist. In Japanese, measuring with the eye, and in Russian, by the fingers. All these terms express an imprecise method of guidance by common knowledge, a protocol of estimation. By definition, a rule of thumb features relatively unstructured methods to achieve results. In practice, it is anything that can plausibly aid the solution of a problem, but is not justified from a scientific or philosophical perspective, either because it doesn't need to be or simply because it can't be justified through anything other than results. But these dictionary definitions lack punch and clarity. Although it's insightful to know the term derives from the Greek verb heuriskein, which means to find, it's better to list the 4 key characteristics of a rule of thumb, which can be illustrated with a simple rule of thumb used to improve a player's chess game. Control the center of the board. First, a rule of thumb reduces the time and effort needed to search for a solution to a problem. A player could plan for as many specific game scenarios as possible, but by generally positioning their pieces to cover spaces in the center of the board, most of those scenarios will be covered without fretting about the details. Second, it can secure a probability of success within given parameters, but it does not guarantee success. A player who controls the center of the board will not necessarily win every game, but a chess hobbyist who makes a point of doing so will be more likely to win against opponents who ignore this rule. Third, it can remain valid while simultaneously contradicting other rules of thumb that help solve the same problem. A player may also win by remembering to establish outposts for your knights, or keep your bishops on diagonals, even while doing so could give up control of the board's center. Fourth, it rejects absolute standards. Rules of thumb are designed to be applied and judged according to a problem's context, but become less useful, perhaps even meaningless, when considered abstractly or objectively. A chess theorist won't be able to find solid grounds on which to say that control the center of the board is any better a rule of thumb than save your king's moves for the late game, and a player might find that every rule they followed before suddenly becomes useless when they try a game of speed chess. Apply these characteristics to the cathedral's head mason. First, the proportional rule could size a stable wall width in a matter of minutes, without spending the time needed to learn the mathematical knowledge to which he lacked access. Second, although any grand stone structure ran the risk of collapse, he could be certain enough that masons throughout history had supported a cathedral with arches designed using the proportional rule, and his was likely to survive as well. Third, sizing a supporting wall using this rule alone might create too weak a wall, so as the head mason determined the stone's quality, he invoked other rules of thumb that altered the calculation. Finally, these Gothic design rules that are so robust when building cathedrals fail absolutely and catastrophically when applied beyond the construction of medieval stone architecture. Modern methods reveal the heaviest load that a particular structure can hold to an engineer, who then designs the structure with a safety margin that holds up to 5 times the expected load. If instead an engineer decided to bring back the mason's proportional rule when designing a modern skyscraper, it would collapse into rubble under its own weight, likely before even being completed. Yet many of the masons' cathedrals that follow this same proportional rule survive today as houses of worship and tourist attractions. It's tempting to think of the methods of antiquated builders as placeholders until the real answers arrived in our scientific age to build our skyscrapers and spacecraft. This might lead us to view the masons' design methods as proto-engineering, a primitive method that evolved into the sophisticated ones used by modern engineers. But nothing of the kind happened. These proportional rules worked in Gothic buildings because the masons never exposed their available and abundant material, stone, to...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?